When last we left off, things were looking pretty bad for the Allied powers in World War I. It's the spring of 1940. Hitler has effectively conquered all of the European continent. Only Great Britain of the Allies really stands ready to resist him. Meanwhile, Stalin and the Soviet Union are still involved in the non-aggression pact with Hitler, which means he has free rein to pretty much do what he wants at this point. However, things are about to turn, and things are not about to go well for the Axis powers. The subject of this screencast is Turning Points of World War II. As we can see here, the Axis controlled almost all of Europe, culminating in the fall of France after the disaster at Dunkirk in June of 1940. Now, if you're having a little bit of deja vu right now, you shouldn't be surprised. Hitler is in pretty much the same situation in 1940 that Napoleon was in 1804. Effectively, he's controlling the continent with the exceptions of Great Britain and Russia. Of course, now it's the Soviet Union. Hitler now, again, wants to avoid the mistake of Germany in World War I and not face a two-front war. Therefore, his strategy was going to be use the Blitzkrieg to wipe out the Allies, including France and Britain, and then he would turn his attention to and violate the non-aggression treaty between himself and Stalin's Russia. To do this, however, he still has to take out the British. Now, you may notice that Britain is an island. This obviously poses a problem, as invasions from the sea are some of the most difficult and dangerous military operations there are. That's what makes the later D-Day invasion in 1944 such an incredible success. Hitler then decides that rather than launch an Operation Sea Lion, an invasion of Britain, he's going to try to break the British from the air. And starting in the summer of 1940, what becomes known as the Battle of Britain takes place. Hitler's plan is to use the Air Force, which now, given his control of the continent, means planes are a very short distance away from being able to hit virtually any target in England. In using the Air Force, he hopes to cripple the British economy. So this is one example of total war. He's not just attacking military installations, he's attacking the factories and fields that supply them with resources. He also engages in total war in that he wants to break the spirit of the British. In fact, a word called frightfulness is actually part of the German overall strategy in the war. Frighten your enemy into submission if you can. Obviously, this does not work. Why not? A couple of bad decisions made. First of all, although the raids start out going after military targets like air bases and military troop centers, ultimately the Luftwaffe starts going after civilian targets. Not just the factories, but hospital areas, schools, residential areas. The psychological war becomes almost as important as the economic and resource-based war. Definitely a miscalculation on Hitler's part. Secondly, the Royal Air Force, which had done such a great job protecting the Allied evacuation at Dunkirk, does another magnificent job during the Battle of Britain, firing down 2 German planes for each British plane shot down. This is actually going to have a major impact on the next big turning point that we're going to be speaking about momentarily. The upshot, though, is that British casualties are much lower than expected. And, thanks to the speeches of Prime Minister Winston Churchill, British morale is going to be kept up. Churchill, again, you may remember, was not the original choice of a lot of people to be Prime Minister for wartime. However, he turns out to be the right guy, the right place, in the right time. And you can find all kinds of speeches and clips of him online, and again, one of my more fascinating people in world history, just a personal aside here. But not just for Churchill, but also for the British people themselves, did a tremendous job in resisting the onslaught of air attacks, and therefore Hitler was not able to bring Britain under submission. Therefore, it would be folly, stupid, to attack Russia until he's got Britain under submission, right? Hitler seems to think differently. In June of 1941, he decides to go ahead anyway with what he calls Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of Russia, in violation of his non-aggression treaty. His plan is to almost reverse what the original plan was when the war broke out. Where the original called for him to smash France and Britain, then turn on Russia, he is hoping to access Soviet land, fields, and most importantly, fuel resources like oil and gasoline, which the Soviets had tremendous amounts of, and then use those to turn around and deal the final crushing blow to the British. So once again, he plans to use the Blitzkrieg to get a quick victory. Again, deja vu kicks in here. Remember that Napoleon had also thought very much the same thing. And this is going to fail for a number of reasons. Most significantly, the lack of resources. By this time, the British had started to mount much more resistance in fighting the Italians in North Africa. The Greeks were also putting up a tremendous fight against Mussolini's troops, which means Hitler can't devote all of his resources to the Russian campaign. He not only has to keep troops on the French coast to stave off any British attacks, but now he's got to send troops to North Africa to help the Italians and to Greece to help the Italians. So he isn't hitting Russia with everything he possibly could have. The Blitzkrieg is also going to be lacking in air support, largely because the Luftwaffe had been decimated in the Battle of Britain, and German industry, and you may remember this from an earlier unit, did not have the capacity to manufacture enough planes to make up the difference for what they had lost. Therefore, the troops on the ground were not receiving adequate support from the air. Once again, bad planning comes into the equation. Hitler decides not to focus his attack on the Soviet capital of Moscow, but instead towards the southwest corner of the Soviet Union, specifically the city of Stalingrad, which would be the gateway to Russian oil fields and the other resources that he needed. However, when he sends them to Stalingrad, he fails to give them supplies for winter warfare, which means his German troops are going to be going in starting in the summer, but eventually they're going to have to fight Russia in the winter. Deja vu for a third time. What happened to Napoleon's troops when he went in there? Nothing good. For whatever else you might say about the Russian military, the one greatest asset is General Winter. Temperatures at times reached 40 below zero. The Russians, used to fighting this, and also fighting in a defensive war, were also at a tremendous advantage in this type of warfare. Ultimately, at Stalingrad, an entire army's worth of German troops, up to 2 million, were killed or captured. And of those who were captured and brought back to Russian POW camps, only about 10% ever returned. So now Hitler finds himself fighting on multiple fronts. The West, to keep the British off. He's fighting in North Africa and Italy to support Mussolini. And now he also has the largest army in the world in a deathlock to the east. About the only thing worse that could happen at this point was if the United States were to join the war. Do you think you know where you're going next? I think so. When the war broke out in September of 1939, the United States was officially neutral. We didn't join up with either side. And in fact, isolationism was a very popular trait. People figured, geographically anyway, that since we were literally oceans away from Japan fighting China, and from Germany and Italy fighting against Britain and Russia, that we didn't have to be involved in anything. One voice that was famous at this time for speaking the other way was the cartoonist at the right. And if you recognize this artwork, yes, it is Dr. Seuss, who before he started illustrating children's books was a well-known political cartoonist. In this one, the Nazi woodpecker has basically been knocking down trees ranging from Yugoslavia to Greece to Norway to Holland, and he's chipping away at England, while the American tree and the bird in it are just kind of laying back a little bit. Obviously, Dr. Seuss is concerned that maybe we're not paying enough attention to what's going on overseas. Someone who would have agreed with Dr. Seuss would have been our president at the time. This is Franklin Roosevelt. As president, he wanted to maintain neutrality as long as he could, but he did want to find ways to help the Allies. For example, when American trade ships went over to Europe, he assigned trade convoys, warships to protect those ships from perhaps German U-boats or British blockades. He also met with Churchill in secret, literally in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, and made an agreement that democracies had common interests, and since the British were effectively a democracy, that they had a spiritual connection and a political connection. Not an alliance yet, anyway. That's going to lead to something called the Lend-Lease Act. Technically, neutral countries aren't supposed to help belligerents, countries that are aggressors and attackers in war. However, a loophole allowed the U.S. to contribute to countries who were simply defending themselves. And under the auspices of this act, Roosevelt was able to provide tanks and other military supplies as well as cash to countries who were defending themselves, like the British. Similar to World War I, the U.S. was more spiritually and traditionally aligned with the Allies. So that's a similarity there. However, it's not the Germans or the Italians that ultimately bring the U.S. into the war, but the Japanese, of course, in the attack on Pearl Harbor, a date which will live in infamy. Japan had been upset about the U.S. embargo on items like oil and steel, which threatened their industrial base and therefore their dominance of the Pacific, which was their goal. With Pearl Harbor, Japan hoped in one shot to take out the U.S. fleet based at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, and deliver a blow so devastating that the U.S. would have to sue for peace and avoid a long drawn-out war. It failed for a number of reasons. First, a lot of the ships that were sunk at Pearl Harbor were actually able to be raised and salvaged, so they were put back in place. The aircraft carriers, which were now the key to any naval operations, were actually not at Pearl Harbor that day and were on maneuvers, and therefore they were ready to go. And go they did, because at this point, Roosevelt now had full support for the war, and you'll see from the timeline here. December 7th, Japan attacks Pearl Harbor and declares war on the United States. The next day, Roosevelt goes to Congress and delivers the famous date which will live in infamy speech, and Congress resultingly declares war on Japan. 3 days later, Hitler and Mussolini both decide to declare war on the United States and fulfill their obligations to their ally Japan. So Roosevelt does get war with Japan, but he also ends up getting war with Hitler and Mussolini, which is something that in all likelihood he also wanted. So now you have the Axis fighting literally on worldwide fronts, and now you have the world's greatest economic and industrial power involved on the side of the Allies. Matter of time from here on in, and we'll see you next time.